Breaking overnight, the U.S. military says it conducted new strikes on 3 alleged drug trafficking boats. The U.S. military says 8 people were killed. These attacks in the Eastern Pacific this time bring the number of people killed during this entire military campaign by the president to at least 95 since it began in September. This also comes as the justification for these strikes is being put more and more in the spotlight and, quite frankly, under a microscope. CNN's Elaina Treene is at the White House for us this morning with the latest here. Elaina, the Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State, they're briefing lawmakers today. What are you hearing about this?
Yeah, this is going to be fascinating because all lawmakers, Kate, both in the House and Senate, are expected to have these closed-door classified briefings with Hegseth and Rubio today. So we're told that the first briefing is going to be with senators at 10 a.m., of course, on these ongoing military operations in the Pacific and the Caribbean. And then afterwards, they'll give a similar briefing to the House. Now, we also know that the House Armed Services Committee is expecting to have a briefing later this week with Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley, I should say. He likes to go by Mitch. He's the one who had led that operation back in September, that double tap strike on a boat traveling off the coast of Venezuela that ended up, becoming the subject of much scrutiny over these operations of late. And so all of this is going to be fascinating because a lot of lawmakers have been asking for this kind of access to a lot of these classified materials and getting answers.
Breaking overnight, the U.S. military says it conducted new strikes on 3 alleged drug trafficking boats. The U.S. military says 8 people were killed. These attacks in the Eastern Pacific this time bring the number of people killed during this entire military campaign by the president to at least 95 since it began in September. This also comes as the justification for these strikes is being put more and more in the spotlight and, quite frankly, under a microscope. CNN's Elaina Treene is at the White House this morning with the latest. The Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State, they're briefing lawmakers today. What are you hearing about this? Yeah, this is going to be fascinating because all lawmakers, both in the House and Senate, are expected to have these closed-door classified briefings with Hegseth and Rubio today. So we're told that the first briefing is going to be with senators at 10 a.m. on these ongoing military operations in the Pacific and the Caribbean. And then afterwards, they'll give a similar briefing to the House. By the way, I am trying to do my best to gather all the information I can for you and share it with you. Please leave your likes and comments, and I would be grateful if you subscribed. Let's continue. Now, we also know that the House Armed Services Committee is expecting to have a briefing later this week with Admiral Mitch Bradley, I should say. He likes to go by Mitch. He's the one who led that operation back in September, that double tap strike on a boat traveling off the coast of Venezuela that ended up becoming the subject of much scrutiny over these operations of late. And so all of this is going to be fascinating because a lot of lawmakers have been asking for this kind of access to classified materials and getting answers from people like Hegseth and Rubio who have been behind a lot of these operations. Now, of course, I think one of the most interesting things is going to have our relentless reporters chasing down these different lawmakers after these briefings. Specifically, I think I'm eager to hear the reaction from a lot of the Republican lawmakers who have been critical of many of these strikes. But as you mentioned, despite all of the scrutiny we've seen over these broader operations, and specifically that double tap strike back in September, the military and the Pentagon have not slowed down their operations. We saw more strikes last night against 3 alleged drug trafficking boats in the Eastern Pacific that now brings the total number of people who are expected to have been killed in these strikes to at least 95 people. Another thing is, we also saw the president take a big move last night by declaring or classifying narcotics and fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, a huge move that is going to try and provide even more legal basis for what they're doing with these operations. Which is interesting, though, because when it comes down to it, there was a lot of conversation of what's coming out of Venezuela and what's coming out of Colombia. It's not fentanyl. That's not where it's coming from anyway. So there's maybe a justification for a different problem. The U.S. military says 8 people are dead following a strike on 3 alleged drug trafficking boats in the Eastern Pacific. U.S. Southern Command in a post on X says the boats were moving along known, quote, narco-trafficking routes and were engaged in narco-trafficking. Now this, as the president says, he's calling illegal fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction. We're formally classifying fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, which is what it is. No bomb does what this is doing. Joining the discussion are Zolan Cano-Youngs, CNN political analyst and White House correspondent for the New York Times, Chuck Rocha, former senior advisor to the Bernie Sanders presidential campaigns, and Ashley Etienne, former White House official under George W. Bush. So Zolan, I was reading this executive order, and it says illicit fentanyl is closer to a chemical weapon than a narcotic. And people have talked about how lethal fentanyl can be even to the touch. But it's also talking about the idea of how you go after it all. Does this designation mean anything in terms of how the government operates, or is this kind of a rhetorical or political exercise? You know, there's no doubt the devastating toll fentanyl has taken on the United States, but there are real questions about how accurate the descriptions are in this executive order and what the practical impact would be. The executive order is making a claim that this isn't just a means of terrible addiction and the root of a drug epidemic in the United States, but rather that it's been used as an actual weapon of war, a weapon of mass destruction. It says the potential for fentanyl to be weaponized for concentrated large-scale terror attacks by adversaries is a serious threat to the United States. Chuck, what do you think about this designation? There's two things. If you have a family member that was impacted by fentanyl, you would want it to be called a weapon of mass destruction. I mean, the drug is horrible. I do think that there's ramifications of it being called that because of what they probably will ask Congress for eventually. If you see what this is paving the road to that. Because the last time we talked about weapons of mass destruction, we ended up in what is now called the forever war. And the pursuit of that and the evidence of that, this is language that is familiar to the American people. And let me be clear, any American wants to keep drugs out of America. We want to keep drugs out of the hands of children. But there are protocols that you go through in engagement. And Ashley said something really important. When he takes it to Congress, Congress is the one who is supposed to wage war, and there should be a War Powers Act. Yesterday, Senator Ruben Gallego in Arizona brought this up because he's like, Congress is supposed to be the one saying if and when we go to war, unless there's an imminent threat, which is what you saw yesterday in the language that he put in the executive. To push back on this for a second, the Defense Department released a national security strategy just a few weeks ago. And what they wanted to do was elevate the fight on the war on drugs, saying that the use of lethal force to replace these strikes, to replace a failed law enforcement only strategy. So they know there's a way to do this through policing, but they're saying that has failed for like 20, 30 years. I think it's fair to see this in the vein of the administration trying to build their argument to justify their actions in the Caribbean and in the Pacific that have gathered more and more bipartisan criticism over its legality. When you're talking about these strikes against these boats and the seizure of the oil tanker, which was in some circles seen as an escalation as well militarily, to build the case as you continue these strikes or potential action against the land of Venezuela and any sort of action against Maduro that the president has mused about at this point. I do think it's worth saying, though, experts have said that fentanyl has only been used in a gas attack once, in 2002 by the Russians. The National Defense University also released a report studying potential weapons of mass destruction designations. They said this wouldn't be necessary for fentanyl as well, that it's more of a public health emergency or law enforcement. So they aren't willing to call it a chemical weapon just yet. In the meantime, Ashley, what happens within an administration as people start to mobilize the argument for wartime activity? Well, first of all, you see what they're doing today. In the House and Senate, you have Secretary Rubio and you have Secretary Hegseth both in Congress briefing. Obviously, they're talking about the double tap situation in September, but they're also laying the groundwork. And you watched, we have Democratic congressmen now that have been briefed, which was very important, kind of going back on some of the things they've been criticizing the administration about because they're actually giving classified information that us as the American people don't know of how bad things are. But let me just say one more thing. Venezuela is not just about fentanyl. It's not just about the drugs. Let's remember it's also about Russia and Ukraine. Why not say that? Why go with the fentanyl argument? Because I think that with overdose deaths, the facts don't exactly back up the account that the administration has put out about Venezuela producing all this fentanyl. Fentanyl comes from precursors from China that are then produced in Mexico. Most of the drugs that have come from Venezuela actually end up going to Europe. When you talk to national defense officials, the account here that this is all about drugs, facts don't exactly back up that account. It'll be interesting to see as this argument builds and builds, something like an executive order. Next, there'll be a statement, and we'll see at what point the war on drugs is just a war. Let me add some crucial context here, because what we're witnessing is the Trump administration systematically building a legal and rhetorical framework to justify what many experts are calling war crimes in the Caribbean and Pacific. And the fentanyl designation as a weapon of mass destruction is a key part of that effort. First, let's talk about the death toll. 95 people killed since September. That's not 95 arrests. That's 95 people dead from military strikes on boats in international waters. And the number keeps climbing. Just last night, 8 more killed in the Eastern Pacific. Now, the justification for these strikes has been that these are drug trafficking boats carrying narcotics toward the United States. But as multiple panelists pointed out, the facts don't support that narrative. Fentanyl precursors come from China. They're manufactured into fentanyl in Mexico. Most drugs coming from Venezuela go to Europe, not the United States. So if this isn't really about stopping fentanyl from reaching America, what is it about? Ashley Etienne suggested it might be about Russia and Ukraine, that Venezuela has become a proxy target because of its relationship with Russia. That would make more geopolitical sense than the fentanyl explanation, but it also makes the legal justification even more problematic. Because here's the thing about declaring fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction. That phrase carries enormous legal and historical weight. The last time we talked seriously about weapons of mass destruction was in the lead up to the Iraq War. Remember that? Iraq supposedly had WMDs. We needed to invade to prevent them from being used. Congress authorized military force. We launched a war that lasted 2 decades, cost trillions of dollars, killed hundreds of thousands of people, destabilized an entire region. And it turned out there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The entire justification was based on faulty or deliberately misleading intelligence. But by the time we figured that out, we were already committed to what became known as the Forever War. Chuck Rocha is absolutely right to draw that parallel. Declaring fentanyl a WMD is paving the road to expanded military action. It's creating the rhetorical and legal framework to escalate from boat strikes to potentially invading Venezuela or launching attacks on land targets. And Trump has already mused about action against Maduro. He's talked about regime change in Venezuela. The seizure of that oil tanker was seen by many as an escalation, a move from targeting boats at sea to directly confiscating Venezuelan state assets. Where does it go from there? The executive order Trump signed is carefully worded to suggest fentanyl isn't just a drug epidemic, but an actual weapon being deployed against America. It claims the potential for fentanyl to be weaponized for concentrated large-scale terror attacks by adversaries is a serious threat to the United States. But as Zolan pointed out, experts say fentanyl has only been used in a gas attack once, in 2002 by Russians. The National Defense University studied whether fentanyl should be designated a WMD and concluded it's more appropriately treated as a public health emergency or law enforcement issue, not a chemical weapon. So we have an administration ignoring expert advice, disregarding the actual facts about where fentanyl comes from and where Venezuelan drugs go, and declaring a substance a WMD to justify military strikes that have killed 95 people and counting. And now Hegseth and Rubio are giving classified briefings to Congress. Why? To show lawmakers classified information that supposedly justifies these actions, to give them intelligence that the American people can't see or evaluate, to create political cover for Democrats who have been criticizing the strikes by telling them things are worse than they know. Ashley noted that some Democratic congressmen who were briefed have backed off their criticism. That's deeply concerning because we've seen this movie before. We saw it with Iraq. Show Congress classified intelligence that can't be publicly debated or verified. Create a sense of imminent threat. Get authorization for military action. Launch a war. And by the time the public realizes the intelligence was wrong or exaggerated, it's too late. The double tap strike in September is particularly troubling. That's the one where Admiral Mitch Bradley ordered a boat struck, then when survivors were in the water, ordered a second strike to kill the survivors. That's a potential war crime. Attacking shipwreck survivors is explicitly prohibited under the Geneva Conventions. And despite mounting scrutiny over that strike, despite bipartisan criticism, despite questions about legality, the administration hasn't slowed down. They keep launching strikes. They keep killing people. And now they're building the legal framework to escalate even further by declaring fentanyl a WMD. Senator Ruben Gallego raised the crucial constitutional question. Congress is supposed to declare war. The War Powers Act exists for a reason. The president can't just unilaterally decide to wage war unless there's an imminent threat. But by declaring fentanyl a WMD, Trump is trying to create that sense of imminent threat that would justify military action without congressional authorization. And here's what's so insidious about this approach. Everyone agrees fentanyl is devastating. It has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. If you have a family member impacted by fentanyl, you absolutely want something done about it. So declaring it a WMD sounds reasonable on its face. But the question isn't whether fentanyl is dangerous. The question is whether military strikes on boats in the Caribbean and Pacific are an appropriate or effective response. Whether killing 95 people, many of whom may have just been fishermen or sailors on boats carrying drugs they didn't know about, is justified. Whether we should be building toward a potential war with Venezuela over a drug crisis that has its roots in China and Mexico. The facts don't support the administration's narrative. Venezuela isn't the source of America's fentanyl crisis. Most fentanyl comes through Mexico from Chinese precursors. Most Venezuelan drugs go to Europe. So the strikes aren't actually addressing the fentanyl problem facing Americans. What they are doing is killing people in international waters without due process, without trials, without meaningful oversight, and potentially setting the stage for a much larger military conflict that could become another forever war. The Defense Department's national security strategy explicitly says they want to use lethal force to replace failed law enforcement approaches to drugs. Think about what that means. Instead of working with other countries on law enforcement cooperation, instead of going after cartels through intelligence and police work, instead of addressing the demand side of the drug crisis through treatment and prevention, they want to use the military to kill people they suspect of drug trafficking. That's not a war on drugs. That's just war. And calling fentanyl a WMD is how they're going to justify it. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of these classified briefings. Will lawmakers who see the intelligence push back on the legal issues? Or will they be convinced by whatever Hegseth and Rubio show them that these strikes are necessary and justified? History suggests we should be very skeptical of classified intelligence used to justify military action. We should demand transparency. We should insist on congressional oversight. And we should be extremely wary of allowing any president to designate substances as WMDs to justify wars without proper authorization. 95 people are dead. The administration shows no signs of stopping. They're escalating the rhetoric with WMD designations. They're building political cover through classified briefings. And they're ignoring both the facts about fentanyl sources and the legal questions about these strikes. This is how we slide into another forever war. This is how constitutional checks and balances get bypassed. This is how military adventurism gets justified through threat inflation and misleading rhetoric. Subscribe to follow this story because it's not going away. The strikes continue. The death toll climbs. The administration builds its case for escalation. And Congress needs to step up and do its constitutional duty to check presidential war-making power before this spirals completely out of control.